That eyesore has been dragging down this entire street for 30 years, and frankly, we're all tired of looking at it. Someone needs to tell that old woman she doesn't get to let a property rot just because she's too stubborn or too broke to fix it. The voice belonged to Craig Whitmore. He was standing in the middle of Sycamore Lane on a Tuesday morning in late October, one hand on his hip, the other gesturing broadly at the house across the street as though it were a personal offense. He was speaking to no one in particular and to everyone at once, a cluster of neighbors near his driveway, the two men from the Homeowners Association with their clipboards, the young couple from 3 doors down who had paused their morning walk to listen. His voice carried the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being agreed with. Nobody disagreed. The house he was pointing at was old. The porch sagged on one side. The paint had long since surrendered to weather, leaving the wood beneath it silver and cracked. The front garden was overgrown in a way that looked less like neglect and more like something ancient and untamed, roots and vines threading through the earth with quiet authority. A single light burned in the front window. The woman inside did not come out. Her name was Ida Mae Coles. She was 71 years old. She had lived in that house for 43 years, buried her husband in the cemetery 2 miles east, raised 2 daughters within those walls, and paid every property tax bill on time for 4 decades without a single reminder. What Craig Whitmore did not know, what none of them standing on that sidewalk could have guessed, was what that house was sitting on. Not just land, not just memory. Something that would, in a matter of weeks, make every one of them understand exactly what they had been looking at all along. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. When the truth came out, it did not arrive quietly. It arrived in the form of a number so large that Craig Whitmore had to sit down. And when the developers left that morning, he was still sitting. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Ida Mae Coles really was, and what she had been carrying all those years in silence. Here is what most people on Sycamore Lane did not know about Ida Mae Coles. She had not always been the woman in the old house. There was a life before that house, built with a precision and a patience that most people never develop and fewer still sustain. Ida Mae was born in 1953 in Gadsden, Alabama, the third of 6 children. Her father, Walter Coles, worked the loading docks at a textile warehouse and kept a vegetable garden that fed the family through every lean winter. Her mother, Ruth, cleaned houses on the north side of town 6 days a week and came home with her hands raw and her back straight. It was Ruth who sat with Ida Mae on the porch on summer evenings and said the words Ida Mae would carry for the rest of her life. "Baby," her mother said once, pressing a hand to the side of her daughter's face, "the ones who make the most noise are the ones who have the least to protect. You stay low, you build high, and when the time comes, you let what you built do the talking." Ida Mae was 9 years old. She did not fully understand it then. She would spend the next 6 decades learning exactly what it meant. She left Gadsden at 18 on a Greyhound bus with a scholarship to study land use management at a state university in Tennessee. She was one of 4 black students in her program. She graduated in 1975 with honors and a minor in environmental law she had added quietly in her 3rd year because she had noticed something her professors had not yet articulated clearly, that the value of land was almost never about the land itself. It was about what was beneath it, beside it, or about to be built around it. She wrote her senior thesis on the long-term appreciation patterns of underdeveloped parcels in mid-sized American cities. Her thesis advisor called it one of the sharpest pieces of student work he had seen in 20 years and offered to help her publish it. She thanked him and declined. She moved in silence. She built in silence. She met James Coles in 1977 at a church potluck in Nashville. A soft-spoken man who repaired appliances for a living and read history books on his days off. They married in 1979 and moved to Sycamore Lane in 1981, when the neighborhood was still mixed and unpolished and the houses were priced accordingly. Ida May had spent 6 years saving from her position as a land use analyst at a regional planning firm, and during those 6 years she had been watching a particular corridor of land on the eastern edge of the city with the same quiet attention her mother had given to every dollar that came into the Coles household. The house cost them $42,000. It was not the house that interested Ida May. It was the address, and more specifically, what the address sat adjacent to. A wide, undeveloped strip of land running along the back edge of the property that the city had zoned as a green buffer in 1968, and then, in the bureaucratic shuffle of 2 subsequent administrations, quietly reclassified without ever formally transferring ownership. Ida May had found the discrepancy in 1979. She spent 2 years and most of her savings verifying it through county records, historical deed searches, and one consultation with a land attorney in Memphis named Gerald Fitch, who looked at her documentation and said slowly, "Mrs. Coles, I think you may own something nobody knows you own." She did not tell anyone, not her neighbors, not her colleagues, not even her daughters, until they were grown. She simply moved into the house on Sycamore Lane, raised her family, kept her garden, and waited with the patience of a woman who had been taught that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful one. James died in 2004. The house aged, the paint peeled, the porch settled, and Ida May, now alone, let it all happen without apology because the house was not the asset. The house had never been the asset. It was the address, and everything the address was quietly becoming worth. Now, let me tell you about Craig Whitmore and the world he believed he ran. Craig Whitmore had moved to Sycamore Lane in 2009, when the neighborhood had begun its slow turn toward something more expensive and more curated. He paid $412,000 for a 4-bedroom colonial 2 doors down from Ida May's house, and spent the years since conducting himself as though the purchase had conferred upon him a form of civic authority the deed itself did not mention. He was 53. He had made his money in commercial real estate brokerage, not development, not ownership, but brokerage, the art of standing between 2 parties and collecting a percentage of what they agreed to. He was good at it. He was loud at it. He drove a silver Mercedes, parked at a slight angle in his driveway, as though the car needed room to breathe. He was the kind of man who used the phrase property values the way a priest uses scripture, as both explanation and verdict. He had been president of the Sycamore Lane Homeowners Association for 4 years, not so much elected to a 4th term as simply continuing to occupy the position after the 3rd, with no one finding the energy to challenge him. His vice president was a man named Dennis Pratt, who had a talent for nodding at the right moments and very little else. The association's 2-person compliance team, Gary and Mitchell, both in their 30s, both carrying clipboards as though the clipboards were weapons, answered to Craig directly. Craig had filed 11 formal complaints against Ida May's property in 6 years: peeling paint, overgrown vegetation, unsecured porch structure, visible dry rot on the fascia boards. Each complaint came with a photograph, a citation number, and a fine schedule that Ida Mae paid without comment every single time within the 14-day window. She never contested a single one. She never appeared at a board meeting. She never sent a letter. This, Craig had decided, was evidence of defeat. He had said as much to Dennis Pratt over bourbon in his kitchen more than once. She's sitting on something she can't handle. Eventually, she'll have to let it go. What he did not understand, what his entire framework of property and value and status was not equipped to process, was that Ida Mae Coles had never once considered selling the house, because the house was not what anyone would be buying. The dramatic irony of Sycamore Lane was this. Craig Whitmore spent his professional life brokering real estate transactions, and he had been living 2 doors from one of the most significant undeveloped land positions in the city's eastern corridor for 4 years without knowing it. He had the vocabulary, he had the instincts, he had the industry contacts, and he had looked at Ida Mae's sagging porch and peeling paint and seen only a problem. He had never once thought to look behind the house. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. The morning Craig made his speech on the sidewalk, Ida Mae was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder of documents that had arrived by courier the previous afternoon. The folder was from a firm called Meridian Land Partners. It was thick. The cover letter opened with a sentence that Ida Mae read twice before she set it down and finished her coffee. She had been expecting something like this for 3 years. She had not known exactly when it would arrive or from whom, but she had known it was coming the way her mother had known when the garden was ready. Not by counting days, but by watching the conditions. The conditions had been building for 18 months. A new transit authority line had been approved by the city council the previous spring, and its eastern terminus, the depot, the hub around which an entirely new district would be organized, had been placed, after 2 years of planning and 1 significant route revision, directly adjacent to the undeveloped strip of land behind Ida Mae's house. The strip that the city had reclassified in 1971 and never formally transferred. The strip that Gerald Fitch had confirmed in 1979 belonged to Ida Mae Coles by virtue of a deed chain running unbroken from 1943 to the present day. Meridian Land Partners had figured this out. It had taken them 14 months of title research, 3 outside counsel opinions, and 1 very long meeting with their lead acquisition attorney before they were certain enough to send the courier. But they were certain now. And the number on the last page of the folder reflected that certainty. Ida Mae did not go to the window when she heard Craig's voice carrying across the street. She poured a second cup of coffee, opened the folder again, and read the number 1 more time. 8 figures. The first digit was a 1. The second digit was a 2. She closed the folder. She set her hand flat on top of it, the way her mother used to set a hand on the Bible after reading a passage that needed a moment to settle. Then she picked up the phone and called Camille Fitch, daughter of Gerald, attorney of record for the past 9 years. Camille answered on the second ring. "They sent the offer," Ida Mae said. A pause. Then Camille said, "How much?" Ida Mae told her. Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Ida," Camille said quietly, "I think we need to meet." Outside on Sycamore Lane, Craig Whitmore was still talking. The compliance officers were still writing. The neighbors were still nodding. The house across the street stood exactly as it always had. Silver, gray wood, sagging porch, ancient garden threading its roots deep into the earth. It had been standing there for 81 years. It had seen everything this street had ever been and everything it was about to become. and it was not finished yet. Now, here is what the morning on Sycamore Lane was about to become, and why the people who witnessed it would spend years trying to explain what they had seen and what they had failed to do. Craig Whitmore did not go home after his speech. He stood there for another 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes something shifted in him from performance into purpose. The neighbors drifted back to their own yards, but Craig remained. Gary and Mitchell remained with him, and Dennis Pratt stood at Craig's elbow with the posture of a man who had learned that proximity to authority was its own form of currency. It was Dennis who said it first. "We could push for a formal hearing. Get the city involved. If she can't demonstrate the means to bring the property into compliance, there are mechanisms." Craig looked at the house. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when someone else has articulated the thought he had already formed. "She's been out of compliance for 6 years, 11 citations, not one substantive repair. At some point, this stops being a neighborly concern and becomes a legal one." Gary wrote something on his clipboard. Mitchell photographed the porch again, though the photographs had never shown anything the previous ones had not already shown. What none of them knew was that a courier had arrived at Ida May's door the previous afternoon. That Camille Fitch was, at that very moment, reviewing the Meridian offer with a title specialist and a tax attorney in a conference room 12 miles away, discussing a number that would have made Craig Whitmore's entire career look modest by comparison. Craig Whitmore, commercial real estate broker, was standing on a public sidewalk discussing mechanisms for compelling a 71-year-old widow to repair or relinquish a property. While that property sat at the center of the largest single-parcel acquisition negotiation in the city's eastern corridor in 30 years. He had the vocabulary. He had the instincts. He had spent his career in rooms where numbers like that were discussed. And he was standing on a sidewalk talking about fascia boards. He did not know. And that not knowing was about to cost him more than he could calculate. That afternoon, Craig called a contact at the city's code enforcement division, a man named Phil Garrett, who owed him a favor from a zoning variance dispute 2 years prior, and asked whether there was any mechanism for expediting a formal inspection of a property with a long violation history. Phil said there was. Craig said he would appreciate some calls being made. Phil said he would see what he could do. 3 days later, a city code enforcement vehicle parked in front of Ida May's house at 9 in the morning. 2 inspectors climbed out and knocked on her door. Ida May opened it. She was wearing a cardigan the color of dark plum and had a cup of coffee in her hand, and she looked at the 2 men on her porch with an expression that was not surprise and was not alarm. It was something closer to recognition. She had been expecting something like this, not the specific form, but the general shape of it. The pressure that arrives when someone decides your patience is weakness. "Mrs. Coles," the first inspector said, "we've received a formal complaint requesting a comprehensive structural and code compliance inspection of this property. We're required to conduct it today." Ida May looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. 4 words. The inspectors spent 2 hours in the house. They measured, photographed, tested the porch boards, examined the foundation, checked the electrical panel, ran the water pressure. They went through every room with the methodical attention of men who had been told this inspection mattered. What they found surprised them. The exterior was aged, yes, the paint gone, the porch sagging, the wood silvered and cracked in the way of very old things left to weather honestly. But the interior was something else. The electrical system had been updated in 2018. The plumbing was sound. The foundation showed no structural compromise. The roof had been replaced in 2020 with material rated for 30 years. The house was old on the outside. It was maintained on the inside with a precision that spoke of someone who knew exactly which things mattered and which things were only appearances. The lead inspector, a man named Raymond Okafor, who had been doing this work for 16 years, stood in Ida Mae's kitchen and looked at the updated panel and the sound plumbing and felt something shift in him. He had been told, by the way this inspection had been arranged, what he was supposed to find. He was finding something different. He looked at Ida Mae, who was sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee and her folder, watching him with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for the world to catch up to what she already knew. "Mrs. Coles," Raymond said, "I want to be straightforward with you. The structural integrity of this property is sound. There are cosmetic violations on the exterior that are real and documentable, but this is not an unsafe structure. I'm going to write exactly what I find." Ida Mae looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I know you will." 7 words. She said them without emphasis, without relief, without performance. She said them the way her mother used to say things that were simply true. Raymond Okafor wrote exactly what he found. His report, filed 2 days later, noted 11 exterior cosmetic violations and 0 structural deficiencies. It recommended a standard 90-day remediation timeline and explicitly stated that the property posed no safety risk to its occupant or to the neighborhood. It was, by every professional measure, an honest document. Phil Garrett read it and called Craig Whitmore. When Phil was done, there was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. "That's it?" Craig said. "That's what the inspector found," Phil said. Craig hung up without saying thank you. What he did not know was that Raymond Okafor had also, quietly, noted in a supplementary memo the circumstances under which the inspection had been requested, the political favor, the expedited timeline, the nature of the complaint. Raymond had seen this shape of thing before, the formal mechanism weaponized against a particular kind of neighbor. He filed the memo with his supervisor, a woman named Carol Delaney, who had been with the department for 22 years and who read it twice before she picked up her phone. Carol Delaney was the fair-minded authority in a building full of people who had learned to look away. She did not look away. She called the city's inspector general's office and reported the nature of the request. Not loudly, not with drama. She simply made the call the situation required and documented that she had made it. The Inspector General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into whether a city employee had used his position to facilitate a targeted code enforcement action against a private citizen at the request of a third party. The inquiry was quiet. It was early, but it was open. And Craig Whitmore did not know it existed. He was still thinking about fascia boards. Now, here is what happened the following week, and why the morning it happened was the last ordinary morning Sycamore Lane would ever have. Camille Fitch had spent 10 days reviewing the Meridian offer with the precision her father had taught her and the sharpness she had developed entirely on her own. She brought in a commercial real estate appraiser, a transit corridor specialist, and a tax attorney who had handled transactions of this scale before. She had also, at Ida Mae's instruction, researched Craig Whitmore specifically, his brokerage firm, his license status, his HOA position, his history of complaints. Camille laid all of it on her conference table and looked at it the way her client looked at things, patiently, without hurry, with the understanding that the complete picture was always more useful than the urgent one. The Meridian offer was real and serious, but in Camille's professional assessment, approximately 30% below what the land would ultimately support in a competitive process. She told Ida May this on a Thursday afternoon, sitting across from her in the small front room of the house on Sycamore Lane, the folder open between them on the coffee table. "They know what they have," Camille said, "but they're hoping you don't." Ida May looked at her. "How long have they known?" 14 months of title research. They're certain. They just think they got there first." Outside, the old garden moved in a light wind, the vines threading through the iron fence with their customary patience. "What do we do?" Ida May asked. Camille set a second folder on the table. "We go to market. Controlled, structured, 3 competing developers, minimum. We let them know about each other. We set a deadline." Ida May picked up her coffee. She looked at the garden through the window. She thought about her mother's hands, raw from other people's floors. She thought about the bus from Gadsden. She thought about Gerald Fitch in his Memphis office, looking at her documentation and saying slowly, "Mrs. Coles, I think you may own something nobody knows you own." She had known for 45 years. She had waited for 45 years. She could wait a few more weeks. "Make the calls," she said. 3 words, that was all. Camille reached out to Meridian Land Partners, to a second firm called Eastgate Development Group, and to a third called Vantage Urban Partners, which had been circling the Eastern Corridor for 2 years and had been waiting, according to their own public filings, for a parcel of exactly this size and position. She sent each of them the same packet, a summary of the land's legal history, the deed chain, the transit authority documentation, and a 1-page letter stating that the owner was prepared to enter into a structured competitive process with a deadline of 21 days. She did not tell them about each other, not yet. She let the silence do its work. The first call back came within 4 hours from Eastgate. The second came the following morning from Vantage. By the end of the week, all 3 firms had confirmed participation, and Vantage had already indicated that they considered the existing Meridian offer to be a floor, not a ceiling. Ida May received this news on a Friday evening, sitting on her porch with a glass of sweet tea and the last of the October light coming through the old oak at the edge of the yard. She listened to Camille's summary, asked 2 questions, and then sat for a while in the quiet after the call ended. She thought about James. She thought about him reading his history books in the chair by the window, the one that was still there, in the same place after 20 years. He had known about the land from the beginning. She had told him everything before they were even engaged, because she had decided early that she would not build anything real with someone who did not know what she was building toward. James had listened to all of it and then said simply, "Then we'll wait." That was James, patient as soil. She finished her tea. She went inside. She stood for a moment with her hands on the edge of the kitchen counter, looking at the room that had fed her daughters and her husband and 43 years of ordinary mornings. She was not finished yet. The following Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after Craig Whitmore had stood on the sidewalk and called her house an eyesore, the competitive process closed. All 3 firms had submitted final offers, each given the same deadline, the same documentation, and the same silence from Ida May's side that communicated, without a word being said, that the owner was not desperate and was not in a hurry. The highest offer came from Vantage Urban Partners. It was not the number on the first page of the Meridian folder. The competitive process had done what Camille said it would do, and the number Vantage put on the table was larger, significantly larger. It reflected what the land was actually worth to a developer who understood what the Eastern Transit Terminus meant and who had been waiting 2 years for exactly this opportunity. Camille called Ida May at 8 in the morning and read the number out loud, carefully, the way you read something that deserves to be heard completely. Ida May was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Call them back. Tell them yes." 6 words. She said them the way her mother had said things that were simply true, without triumph, without performance, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 45 years knowing exactly what she was building toward and had simply waited for the world to arrive at the same understanding. Outside on Sycamore Lane, it was an ordinary Tuesday morning. Craig Whitmore's silver Mercedes sat in its driveway at its customary slight angle, as though the car still needed room to breathe. Nobody on that street knew yet what had just happened. They were about to find out. The reckoning did not arrive with noise. It did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived the way most consequential things arrive, quietly, on a Tuesday morning, in the form of 3 black SUVs turning onto Sycamore Lane and parking, one after another, in front of the silver-gray house with the sagging porch and the ancient garden. Ida May had known they were coming. Camille had called the night before to confirm the time. She was standing on her porch when the SUVs arrived, wearing a dark green dress and her good shoes, the ones she kept in the box at the back of the closet, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had known all along that it was worth waiting for. The man who stepped out of the first SUV was named Marcus Webb, Acquisition Director for Vantage Urban Partners. He had spent 2 years looking at the Eastern Corridor with the focused attention of someone who understood that the transit terminus changed everything. The land values, the development potential, the entire economic logic of a district that had been underpriced for a generation. He had read the deed chain. He had read the transit documentation. He had read Camille Fitch's 1-page letter 3 times. He looked at the house. He looked at the garden. He looked at Ida May on the porch. Then he walked up the front path and extended his hand. "Mrs. Coles," he said, "thank you for having us." Ida May shook his hand. She let them walk the property, the house, the yard, the strip of land running along the back edge, the parcel that the city had reclassified in 1971 and never formally transferred, the parcel she had verified and held and waited on for 45 years. Marcus Webb walked it slowly, with 2 colleagues and a surveyor, and Ida May watched from the porch with her coffee. And Camille Fitch stood beside her with a leather portfolio under her arm and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. What they did not notice was that Craig Whitmore was watching from the window of his living room 2 doors down, hands at his sides, his expression moving in the space of 10 minutes, from curiosity to confusion to something that had not yet found its name. He had seen the SUVs. He had seen the surveying equipment. He had seen the woman in the dark green dress on the sagging porch, watching them work with the patience of someone who had always known this was coming. He did not go outside, not yet. Marcus Webb finished his sight walk and came back to the porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Ida May. And there was something in his expression that was not transactional neutrality. It was something closer to respect, the specific respect of someone who understood what it meant to hold something this significant for this long without ever being pressured into releasing it early. "Mrs. Coles," he said. "I think we're ready to proceed." Camille opened her portfolio and set a document on the porch railing. The final executed offer, the number at the bottom representing what 3 competing firms had determined the land was actually worth in an open, structured, deadline-driven process. Ida Mae had already seen the number. She had already said yes. But she looked at it again now, in the October light, on the porch that had held her weight for 43 years, and she felt something settle in her that had been in motion for a very long time. 8 figures, larger than the first offer, significantly larger. She picked up the pen Camille had set on the railing. She signed her name the way her mother used to sign things, with her full name, every letter, as though the document deserved to know exactly who it was dealing with. Not a scratch, not a hurry, every letter. She set the pen down. It was done. And it was at that precise moment, Ida Mae setting the pen down, Marcus Webb reaching for the document, that Craig Whitmore came outside. He had been watching long enough to understand that something significant was happening, and the instincts of a man who had spent his career reading property transactions had finally assembled enough of what he was seeing into a shape that alarmed him. He crossed his lawn to the edge of his driveway and said, with the confident bewilderment of a man who believed he was owed an explanation, "What's going on over here?" Nobody answered him immediately. Marcus Webb turned and looked at him with the mild, professional patience of someone who had been in rooms with men like this before and had learned that the most effective response was almost always silence. Camille Fitch looked at him the way a woman looks at something she has been expecting and is not surprised to see. Ida Mae looked at him last, from her porch, from the height of those old sagging steps, with the October light behind her and the ancient garden at her back. And she did not say anything at all. It was Dennis Pratt who answered. Dennis had come out of his own house when he saw Craig cross the lawn and was standing 2 steps behind him, with the expression of a man who had just begun to understand that he had been standing behind the wrong person for a very long time. "Craig," Dennis said quietly, "I think something's happened." Craig looked at the document in Marcus Webb's hand. He looked at the Vantage Urban Partners logo on the nearest SUV. He was a commercial real estate broker. He knew that logo. He knew what Vantage did and where they operated and what kind of transactions they were involved in. He looked at Ida Mae. And then, slowly, in the way of a man whose entire framework of property and value and status is being revised in real time, he began to understand what he had been looking at for 4 years. Not a problem, not an eyesore, not a widow who couldn't handle what she owned. A position. A 45-year position, held with patience and precision and complete silence, that had just closed at a number that made his entire career look modest by comparison. He did not speak. For once in his life, Craig Whitmore did not speak. He stood at the edge of his driveway with his hands at his sides, and the silence that came out of him was the loudest thing he had produced in years. The neighbors had begun to gather. The young couple from 3 doors down, the woman from the corner house who had nodded along on the morning of Craig's sidewalk speech, Gary from the compliance team who had slowed his car and then stopped it entirely. They gathered at the edges of their lawns and driveways, the way they had gathered 6 weeks earlier to hear Craig call Ida Mae's house an eyesore, and they looked at the SUVs and the surveying equipment and the man in the good coat holding a document that Ida Mae Coles had just signed. And they understood, in the way that crowds understand things, not all at once, but in a wave, one person and then the next, that they had been wrong about what they were looking at, that they had been wrong for years. That the house, with the silver gray wood and the sagging porch and the ancient garden, was not the problem they had been told it was. It was the center of something. It had always been the center of something, and the woman who lived in it had known that from the beginning, and had said nothing, and had waited, and had been right. Dead silence. Then Marcus Webb said something quietly to one of his colleagues, and they began walking back toward the SUVs, and the moment broke, and Sycamore Lane began to breathe again. Craig Whitmore turned and walked back to his house. He went inside and closed the door, and the silver Mercedes sat in the driveway at its slight angle, and the house behind it was very quiet. He was still thinking about fascia boards. The reckoning that followed was not dramatic. It was a series of moments, each arriving with the quiet inevitability of something that had been in motion for a long time. The Inspector General's inquiry concluded its preliminary phase 6 weeks after Ida May signed the Vantage Agreement. It found sufficient grounds to proceed to a formal investigation and to whether Phil Garrett had used his position to facilitate a targeted inspection of a private citizen's property at the request of a third party. Phil Garrett was placed on administrative leave. The investigation was reported in the local paper, briefly, in a paragraph on the 3rd page of the Metro section. But it was reported. Craig Whitmore's name was not in that paragraph, but 3 people on Sycamore Lane knew it should have been, and word travels on streets like that one, at the speed of coffee and sidewalk conversations and the specific discomfort of people who had nodded along at the wrong moment and were now recalibrating. The Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting in November. Craig did not call it. Dennis Pratt called it, with a formality that suggested he had been thinking about doing so for some time. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Craig Whitmore resigned as president of the Sycamore Lane Homeowners Association. He did not use the word resign. He said he was stepping back. But he signed the form, and Dennis Pratt accepted it with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that proximity to Craig Whitmore was no longer the kind of currency he wanted to hold. The 11 violation files against Ida May's property were reviewed by the association's new interim board and closed without further action. All of them. Every photograph, every citation number, every fine schedule, closed. Raymond Okafor, the city inspector who had written exactly what he found and filed the supplementary memo that started everything, was commended formally by Carol Delaney in his annual review. Raymond had been trying to make senior inspector for 3 years. He made it in December. Carol Delaney, who had called the Inspector General's office without drama and without any certainty it would lead anywhere, received nothing formal. She did not ask for anything formal. She was the kind of person who made the call the situation required and then went back to work. Ida May, who had learned her name through Camille's research, sent her a handwritten note on plain stationery that said simply, "Thank you for seeing what was there." Carol kept the note in her desk drawer for years. Camille Fitch was paid her fee, significant, commensurate with the transaction she had managed, and accepted it without ceremony. She had done her father proud, and she knew it, and that was enough. The house on Sycamore Lane still stood. The transaction had been for the land, the strip behind the property, the parcel Ida May had verified and held for 45 years. The house itself remained hers. Vantage Urban Partners broke ground on the adjacent parcel in the spring, and the construction was loud and constant and completely irrelevant to Ida May, who had known it was coming and had planned for it accordingly. she had the porch repaired in January. Not because anyone told her to, not because of the citation files or the compliance team or Craig Whitmore's sidewalk speeches. She had it repaired because she wanted to sit on it in the spring without the boards shifting under her weight, and because she could, and because she had earned the right to do things in her own time for her own reasons. She hired a carpenter from the neighborhood, a young man named Terrell who had grown up 3 streets over and who did the work carefully and well. The paint she left. The silver gray wood, weathered and cracked and honest, stayed exactly as it was. She had looked at it one morning in February, the light coming through the old oak at the edge of the yard, and decided that some things did not need to be changed just because someone had once called them a problem. On a Saturday in late March, she sat on the repaired porch with a cup of coffee and the early spring light coming through the oak, and she thought about her mother. She thought about Ruth Coles, who had come home 6 days a week with her hands raw and her back straight and had sat on a porch in Gadsden and pressed a hand to the side of her daughter's face and said words that a 9-year-old could not yet fully understand. Stay low, build high, and when the time comes, let what you built do the talking. Ida May had stayed low for 45 years. She had built high in silence without announcement, without the validation of anyone on Sycamore Lane or anywhere else. And when the time came, she had let what she built do the talking. She had not raised her voice, she had not retaliated, she had not needed to. The land had spoken for itself in a language that even Craig Whitmore could not misread. This is not a story about one woman on one street. I want you to understand that before we part. This happens every day. It happens in the gap between what someone looks like and what they have built. It happens in the distance between a sagging porch and a 45-year land position. It happens every time a person is reduced to their appearance, their address, their silence. Every time someone mistakes patience for defeat and restraint for weakness and dignity for surrender. It happens to people who have spent decades building something the world has not yet thought to look for. And it happens in front of crowds who nod along and say nothing and later struggle to explain what they had failed to see. Ida May Coles did not win because she got lucky. She did not win because someone rescued her. She won because she had been right all along, and she had known it, and she had waited with the patience of a woman who had been taught that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful one. The question I keep coming back to is this: how many Ida Mays are out there right now, sitting quietly on a porch that someone else has called an eyesore, building something the world hasn't thought to look for yet? Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever been underestimated the way Ida May was, or watched it happen to someone you knew? I want to hear it. And if these are the kinds of stories you want to keep finding, the people the world overlooked, the ones who built in silence and waited, then stay with this channel because we go looking for them every single week.